Hello and welcome back to the Troutman Pepper Lock Battery and Storage Podcast. I am your host, Bill Derasmo, partner here at Troutman Pepper Lock. Today, I am pleased to have with me Nis Benn, the co-founder and chief commercial officer at Hyme Energy, a maturing grid-scale thermal energy storage solution for industry and utilities. That's HYME.energy. Welcome to the program, Nis.
Thanks a lot. Thank you for having me. I've really been looking forward to this chat.
Well, great to have you on today. As I mentioned, you are the COO at Hyme and have been since November 2021. Before coming to Hyme, you held a variety of what I thought were interesting positions. Take a minute, tell us about your career journey to Hyme, and then we can get into discussing Hyme's business and maybe some other policy and other interesting issues.
Yeah, thanks for that invitation, Bill. So just a very short two sentences on Hyme and then on me. So at Hyme, we're developing a new technology to decarbonize industry and replace natural gas with thermal energy storage, where renewable energy is stored in the thermal storage facility, decarbonize process heat, which is where natural gas is used today. So taking natural gas out, putting in renewable energy through a storage plant. That's the short version. And now me, today, as you say, Chief Commercial Officer of Hyme, been serving in that role for 3 years, a bit more, since we founded in the end of 2021 here in Copenhagen, Denmark. Today, I lead a team of around 7 or 8 people that is working in the breadth of business development, from sales to communication, regulatory work, and basically anything you come up with, from financing, fundraising also. The other day, I was just reflecting on my own career, and actually dawned on me that my first startup was a high school magazine back when I was 16 in 1997, where I went to a high school that didn't have a magazine, and I thought that was a pity. So I went out to potential advertisers around town, knocking doors at the driving school and the hairdressers and stuff like that, getting sponsors to start up the magazine. And of course, it came up, started running. We did 4 editions a year and just had its 25th anniversary. It wasn't something I made any money out of. It was purely voluntary, but it was a startup. Then, I studied some sociology with statistics on top of that, did another startup in the zeros within statistics, a consultancy. We couldn't turn that into a product and we couldn't scale it, so we decided to shut it down. And then I moved around within management consulting in strategy mainly for a number of years before doing a project with the Heart, basically, a political startup. I joined what's called the Alternative Party in Denmark to start up the national organization when the party got into parliament in 2015, and built up a national organization of 98 local committees, ran our first countrywide elections and stuff like that. Then when I was worn out, basically, took a year with my youngest kid and relaxed a bit. And then when I came back, I sort of found out that I wanted to do something to change the world, not from policy, but from business, and started working with startups within the impact space. I think it might have been known then. And then basically now I'm here meeting the right people. We ended up founding this company in 2021 as a spin-out of a nuclear company. And now we're operating independently within the thermal energy storage space.
I like to pride myself on my prep for these podcasts recordings, but I have to admit, I did not know that you started up a high school newspaper. I love that because I wrote back in the day I used to do some guest columns for my school paper and stuff like that. That is a great background. It's a different background, I think, from a lot of other entrepreneurs, because you've got the politics in there, you've got other sort of non-energy type ventures before you ended up in the energy space. But, one of the things I think that's a commonality is if you're working to start something up, you have to be able to talk to the finance people, right? No matter what it is. So there's a lot we could talk about, but maybe we could just start. It just struck me as you were speaking. Maybe we could just start with that. Like, when you have to wear that hat, what's that like when you have to go out to try to fundraise and, get some backing for your company?
But I wear the financing hat or the political hat? Which one of those?
Oh, the financing I meant, but yeah.
Well, when we go out, we are basically trying to keep things super simple. Even though we are deep tech and the energy market is complicated, what we want to talk about is how we can change the world through financial contracts to deploy energy assets. And basically what we want to do is sign heat as a service contracts with industrial off-takers. When that's signed, we construct an asset to deliver heat. That asset is financed, pension funds or banks or whoever we partner with in that specific market. And then it's constructed, it's operated, and then hopefully it'll be transferred, refinanced, and whatever else. So from a finance perspective, it's actually pretty simple what we're doing.
Pivoting from the finance part to sort of the business case part, I asked you this off air, but I'll share with the audience. So in terms of your focus, in terms of Denmark, the EU, and then North America, maybe you could just talk about that and where your company is focused principally right now, and then where it might be in the future, maybe.
Geographically, we're focused almost solely right now on business development within the EU and a home market of Denmark within EU. And the reason is that the heat price that I mentioned, or the heat contract, the willingness to pay for that is simply highest, where the natural gas price, which is today the feedstock for a lot of industrial processes, is highest. And it is highest in the EU for two reasons. One is that we don't produce a lot ourselves, so we import a lot of natural gas. And the second one is that we've been taxing fossil fuels in different ways and quite intensively for a number of years, with the latest being the shared CO2 tax for all fossil emissions in the EU. So the industrial customers, the EU or heat users, are facing an underlying upward going price basically on natural gas from the CO2 tax, and a lot of volatility on the import price as well. So they're really looking to get away from that. And renewables is the other option that's available. And then we are about providing renewables 24/7 and a stable heat price. So you'd also get the price swings on the renewables. And then we just sell that in a heat contract, basically.
No, it's really interesting to hear, because the contrast to the United States, I think, is somewhat significant. The United States has obviously made a big renewables push itself, maybe gone about it in different ways, not through taxation, but other policy pushes. And so there has been a significant build out in solar and wind. And there's, that's one of the reasons why we started the podcast 5-6 years ago, is because of the idea, like you just talked about, of being able to make those the renewable resources more dispatchable, more 24/7. But that being said, the United States, I think, has an abundant natural gas. And so the temptation is to fall back on it because of, I think what's happening in the United States right now is you've got a situation we haven't had in some time, which is you have load growth. And that's, ironically enough, being driven by some of the environmental policies. You've got electrification of vehicle fleets. You've got electrification, say, of home heating and things. But then, of course, there's this data center AI, tremendous growth. And if you're in the space here in the legal policy side, you hear a lot about how are we going to meet this data center need. And so there are certain parts of the country, I think, that just said, hey, we're building gas-fired generation, and we'll try to, we'll try to put the best emissions controls on it we can. But right now, that's what we need. There are other parts of the country where that's probably not realistic still. Like New York State, I think, who knows? But I think it would be difficult, for instance, to build a new combined cycle natural gas plant in New York. So, I think in different states, they'll go for different solutions. But what could Hyme do in the United States to sort of fill that need in areas where it might not be realistic to build a new natural gas-fired plant?
Well, in a market like the US, I think the right partner for Hyme to develop a case would be an industrial company that is looking to be green because either think it's a really good idea or because their location allows them to really make use of relatively cheap renewables around the industrial site. And so those two motivations sort of get married into one. If you really want to be green, you want to take renewables and you want to have them all the time. To do that, you have to have storage. So that could be one motivation. The other one is simply just, if you think the economy of going solar, for example, is better than natural gas or whatever your feedstock is for your process heat, then you also need to store it if you want to have that done. So whatever your motivation is, in a happy marriage with renewables close to our on-site, that's where it could make a difference. So typically a bit far from a city, at an industrial site that has a relatively large heat load. We think in megawatts when we talk about heat, some think in tons of steam per hour, and some do gigajoules and BTUs or whatever. But 10 megawatt and above, which is a lot of constant heat, and we can go even bigger than that as well.
So it sounds like industrial sites, industrial parks would probably be the best candidates.
Yes, it would. And some of those would have a utility company maybe supplying the industrial customers within that park. And then the utility company is probably the right partner for us to sort of build a strategy on greening and making it also more affordable at the same time. We've seen that in Germany, which is a country that has a lot of industrial parks in Europe, that's the right partner. And sometimes it's the individual industrial company.
Well, I think it might be a good segue. Why don't you tell me about the so-called mousetrap, if you will, that Hyme has as compared to maybe some other types of companies. I think it's a good segue into that discussion.
Yeah, so I'm actually not familiar with the term mousetrap.
Well, it just basically means your way of doing things, your technology, the way you're coming at the problem.
I'm going to take maybe a bit of a big step back just to do a quick deep dive on the technical background, and then sort of bring that as quick as I can up to what is it that we offer customers then in the end. So we are using a energy storage technology that is built on a fluid. That fluid is molten salt. Salt is a group of elements that could be many, many, many. You should just think of it as the white powder that you could have at home. You could heat that up, and it looks like water when it melts. Then you could heat that up, just as you could with water. We're just talking much higher temperatures. The specific salt that we use melts at just under 200 degrees Celsius, and then we heat it up to just above 500 degrees Celsius, storing heat in it, and then when we dispense energy, we cool it back down. And the salts are good for energy storage. If you haven't heard about them before, then they're basically really, really good at taking up heat. And so you can put a lot of heat into the same molecule of salt, basically. It doesn't degrade, it doesn't do any harm to it, it doesn't evaporate. It stays where you have it, typically in a big tank. It doesn't give off that heat very easily, so it's a good storage medium, basically. So what we do is we are upgrading this sort of technology with a new salt that has even higher energy density and lasts longer and stuff than what has previously been worked with. And then we're turning it into a product that could serve industry. It's previously been used in concentrated solar power plants, where it's been used to produce power. There's a couple of plants like that in the US as well. So we're using a new sector and electrifying the heating of the salt instead of using concentrated solar. And then basically our plant consists of one tank that has the cold salt around 200 Celsius. We heat it up with electricity, pump it into a hot tank, keep it there until we dispatch it, and then we pump it to a steam generator, putting out steam and heat. The salt is cooled and put back in the cold tank. And then basically the salt runs around from cold to hot, heated and cooled back down while giving off steam to an industrial process. And so when we get to the customer level and move that back to the customer side, we bring a product which is a standardized size with these two tanks squeezed into a relatively small amount of space compared to the energy that they contain. And then we sell the steam coming out. And what we are trying to do in Europe, especially where we know the business case the best, is to basically use the duck curve as you also know it from the States. Take cheapest hours, move those to a 24/7 baseload, basically. And we just see that duck curve really having arrived in Europe as well, with the middle hours of the day in solar countries being basically the price dropping 10% per year in those hours or more, and the negative pricing hours in up to 1,000 hours of the year as well. So that provides a huge opportunity that we could turn into a competitive heat price towards the customer.
Okay, so it's interesting. So you got heat, you got steam. It's a different type of model than we've heard about, I think, previously on our program. So it's interesting how you can distinguish yourselves. But just maybe dive in for a second on in Denmark, in your home market, about that duck curve, because folks here in like California, for instance, that's a big issue. And so how can your technology really fit with that duck curve?
If we think about the system, it's basically a system that can do two things. It can consume electricity, that's the cold to the hot tank side, and then it can produce steam, that's the hot to the cold side. So what we do in practice is that we basically dispatch steam almost all the time to the industrial process that's going on. Some companies shut down over the weekend, but a lot of the customers that we're talking to just have baseload energy needs going slightly up and down. And then in the energy markets, we basically ally ourselves with an energy trader to operate the plant who looks in the day ahead forecast. And they look for those cheapest hours, which are typically from around 11 a.m. to 3, 4, 5 p.m., where the sun is up in the summer especially, and buys the maximum amount of power that we can consume in those hours, fills up the salt with energy, fills up the hot tank, and then overnight and until the next day at 11, just dispatches only. It's also dispatching when it's charging, but then at the night time, it's only dispatching since there's not enough cheap electricity available. In Denmark, though, when you ask about that, we do have a solar and wind pattern. We have a lot of wind energy, and then we have solar in the summer. So we do have a sort of less predictable duck curve, I would say. In the summer, it looks a lot like the duck curve because the sun's there. But in the wintertime, it's wind driving the energy prices up and down. When it's windy, you can have many hours of really cheap prices. And so it doesn't really look like the duck curve, but the principle is the same. Take those cheap hours and smear them out over the day in terms of output.
And in Denmark, is it offshore wind or is it onshore?
During the last 5 years, it's become offshore wind. It was onshore until then. So now the offshore is the dominant factor in what happens in the energy prices at the moment.
Oh, that's really interesting. And remind me, are you part of Nord Pool?
Yes, we are.
Okay.
Yes.
Interesting. And for the U.S. audience, Nord Pool is sort of like, PJM or MISO. It's a regional market. So it's interesting. But it's interesting to hear about that. But we haven't gotten into macro policy issues yet. So why don't we do that? And you talked about offshore wind, and we've talked about how Europe has gone about decarbonization a little bit. So, the United States, like I said, we've made, I think, tremendous inroads in decarbonization with the growth of renewables and other things. But now we've got, we had the presidential election, and, we've got this new phenomenon, at least new over the last, 20 years of load growth, significant load growth. And like I said, I think I sense in certain parts of the country in the U.S. falling back on the use of natural gas. So just from where you're sitting, if you had any thoughts at a high level about how you continue a decarbonization push while at the same time, obviously continuing to keep the lights on, as they say, and continuing to meet customers' needs. And like I said, the United States, I think the new challenge is we've actually had load growth. So I'd just love to get your thoughts on that.
I'm going to probably be speaking about it from a European perspective, since my knowledge of the U.S. sector is probably too poor, but I'll try and make it as relevant as I can. So first of all, I just want to mention the key driver of the European CO2 taxes again that I mentioned initially, basically making it expensive to pollute and thus putting pressure on the prices that industry is seeing, and really just a curiosity from CFOs and site operators to get away from that bottom price, basically. So no matter what the natural gas price is, you're just paying more and more. Then when you move to other policy, what we have seen is two things that have been driving the build out of renewable energy, which is driving then the duck curve, if we just use that term for the cheap hours and availability of renewable. And one is the build out of the offshore sector. In Denmark, we've been doing that with auctions initially, with guaranteed revenue to asset owners. And then we've been moving to contract for difference models. And then in the last auction that we carried out, there was actually a payment back to the state. So a profitable CFD for the state. And now it remains to be seen how the next ones will evolve. I think we'll be going back to some that do cost some money for the state. That the mechanism is continuing and has become the standard in most European countries at the moment. But it's a competitive mechanism that I think, if it's not being used sufficiently in a specific state in the U.S., I believe that's really brought us far on offshore.
It's interesting. Yeah. I mean, and we have some offshore wind that's been developed in the United States, particularly on the East Coast. But now we've got an executive order where that's sort of under a pause, I guess you would say. But, and we've got significant onshore wind as well in the States, especially like in the Midwest or Great Plains. I think what you're going to see, if I had to predict in the United States, is the so-called all of the above. I think you'll continue to see the renewables get built out. Like I said, I think you're going to see probably a little bit of an uptick in natural gas-fired generation. And there's a lot of interest in nuclear again. There were two reactors sited in Georgia, the Vogtle 3 and 4, came
Yeah.
online in the last couple of years. Other than that, there hasn't been much in the way of new nuclear, but I think there's a tremendous interest going forward because it's carbon free, obviously, and it's base load, so dispatchable and all that stuff. So I don't know if what the outlook in Europe is for nuclear. It might not be as rosy, but be curious if you had any thoughts on that front as well.
I think there's a slow renaissance in Europe on nuclear, but actually we grew out of a nuclear company as a spin-out originally, so
Okay.
we do have quite a lot of knowledge about that. That's a small modular reactor company. So we've also been looking into how nuclear and thermal storage deploy together. It's not within our current market focus, but basically we are talking to a lot of nuclear developers because the base load gives them problems as well when renewables are on, basically. So then you can't sell at the price that you are expecting or hoping to. So what do you do with that energy? You can't really shut down your plant, or it's difficult. But nuclear energy is also heat. So it's coming from heat, turned into electricity. And then, so we're talking to a lot of companies actually about redirecting the heat outside of the turbine, stored in thermal energy storage, which could then put it back in at a later time into the nuclear turbine as steam again, and then pick up the production. So you don't have to stop your nuclear plant when you can't sell the heat. You use the electricity, you just put heat into this buffer, basically.
Boy, if you could perfect that, I think you'd have, you'd really have something special. And I think you'd have some interest in the United States because small SMRs, small modular reactors in the United States, there's definitely an uptick in interest there. And I think you'll see some of that get developed. I really do. Because what else are you going to, I mean, if you have a decarbonization push that, notwithstanding maybe some policy changes here in the short term, I think the trend is still going to continue. So I think what else are you going to do? I mean, you're going to add, nuclear is a logical thing to do. So in any event, I think, there'll be an uptick in interest in SMRs in particular, I think. So we'll have to see how that unfolds. Any other applications that you want to mention for Hyme?
Yeah, well, I mean, apart from the nuclear one, which I think, and I hope we will have that post 2030, but until 2030, when we're bringing our tech to the market in what we right now see as the most meaningful fashion, we're focused on that process heat. But that process heat can be sort of divided into a couple of niches, you could say. There's a big normal industry sites. They could be using steam for food ingredients, for example, or for food oil distillation, or for other distillation processes, or for plastics. Basically, heat goes into almost everything, and we fit to a certain temperature range of existing industry. Then we do see niches in industries that are coming up and that are part of the green transition as well. So where new plants are being built, biogas, for example. Biogas has a CO2 purging mechanism built in, so they separate the methane that's been produced from the CO2 that's also in there. So you have combustible methane of natural gas quality, but now CO2 free. You need to get the CO2 out, and that costs you some energy. Today, they either burn their own biogas to do it, or they burn natural gas to provide that heat. These are typically in relatively remote locations with ease to deploy renewables just next door. And you can make your operations completely green instead of just half green, providing methane that's bio, but using natural gas to purge CO2. And there's a lot of biogas coming in Europe and in a lot of other countries as a CO2-free source. So we really see a potential market there. It's the same thing that we do on our side, but that segment is really growing and relatively focused on green and also having a bit of a margin against natural gas that they can live off to finance maybe a slightly higher heat price as well. So a slightly higher willingness to pay. And then we see methanol plants with green methanol, and that entire green plastics, whatever that is people are trying to do in different ways, mixing hydrogen, CO2, and other bio things that are green. They often also need heat in their replication of a traditional industry, but now a green version. And I think we also fit really well there.
And you mentioned 2030. What's the significance there?
We expect to go through our first scaling towards 2030, but the products that we're right now developing have different sizes to fit industry. Then we have built our delivery capability, brought down on costs. We'll be able to broaden out into more geographic markets and into more niches, and potentially also into completely different business models, collaborating with nuclear or utility companies to retrofit old coal power plants, which you could also do with our technology if you wanted. So we want to just have a focus on execution of these first products, make sure that we return some value to our current investors, build some future value, and then see who wants to join basically for the next part of that journey into different markets.
That's interesting. You mentioned coal, and we still have, some significant coal resources that are running in the United States, especially in certain regions. But then there was a push, I think, over the last few years to try to repurpose some of those sites. In the United States, you had the Inflation Reduction Act, where there were some advantages, tax advantages you could take advantage if you repurposed some of those sites. What sites in Europe are sort of ripe for that? Is it Germany that relied a lot on coal-fired generation? Because I understand France was heavy on nuclear. So if you could just give us a quick, give the Americans a quick tutorial on that.
Sure. Yeah, you're completely correct on France. Germany is still really big on coal, especially after they decommissioned their nuclear plants and then the coal plants came back online. But the big coal countries in Europe, apart from that, is definitely Poland. And then we have a lot of old Eastern Europe, which now is coal Europe, but they are still living in the age of coal, I would say. But that also means that they're really curious about this retrofit, because a lot of them are building out their grids as they are industrializing and becoming modern societies still. Some of them are still not consuming as much energy per capita as the Western European countries are. So they have a really broad build out on load growth and renewables and still need to get rid of coal. So there's some really interesting things going on there where I do think that we should seek to play a role again post 2030 when we're there, but we should be there.
Very interesting. This has been a great discussion, and I've learned a lot. It's good to get somebody from a different part of the world on here to talk about some of these issues.
Yeah, so I think the interesting thing of talking to an American is just keeping that perspective in mind of that huge market and keep thinking about how can we fit in. I think that's a really important to remember for us. But I also want to say that we're talking to a lot of American companies on their European operations, and I see all of these American industrial corporations really understand this, even though they're coming from the main majority of the business being in the US, where the trade-offs are not falling out in the same way as they are in Europe. They really want to drive that in Europe as well, and are really pursuing it. And I think the business acumen of these companies is sometimes even bigger than the European ones, because they are really focused on bottom line. And that's what this is about. This is about undercutting the price of natural gas with a green alternative. And I think that frank conversation we have actually more directly with a lot of American companies, whereas the European ones tend to have maybe a bit of green ideology as well, still left in how they conduct business. But yeah, thanks for inviting me, Bill. It's really been a pleasure to talk to you. And thinking about the American perspective is also really good to keep me on my toes and keep me curious about the world.
Well, it's been great having you on the program today, Nis. Is there anything else that you want to talk about before we wrap up?
I think one thing that I really want to say about where this technology is going, what Hyme is doing, is it's pretty saying, for me at least, that at the moment we're in a maturation phase of a project which is the biggest announced thermal energy storage project for industry in the world. We announced it just before Christmas. Right now, we're wrapping up the project financing for that plant. It's in Western Denmark. It's 200 megawatt hours. It's going to be huge. And it's also hopefully going to be a lighthouse for the sector that this can be done profitably and breathe at the same time.
Well, thanks for mentioning that. Can the audience go to your website, hyme.energy, to learn more about that project, or is there some press on that?
There is a press release on it. There definitely is. And we hope to update our website further within the coming months with more details as that project is really firming up.
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic. Thanks for walking through that. And again, thanks for being on our program today. Thank you to the audience, by the way, because without you, there wouldn't be much point in doing this. So we appreciate our listeners continuing to tune into our program when we release these episodes. And we'll leave it there for now. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Copyright Troutman Pepperlock, LLP. These recorded materials are designed for educational purposes only. This podcast is not legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. The The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individual participants. Troutman does not make any representations or warranties, expressed or implied, regarding the contents of this podcast. Information on previous case results does not guarantee a similar future result. Users of this podcast may save and use the podcast only for personal or other non-commercial educational purposes. No other use, including without limitation, reproduction, retransmission, or editing of this podcast may be made without the prior written permission of Troutman Pepper Locke. If you have any questions, please contact us at troutman.com.